Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Sangha. I'm very honored today to introduce for our 20th anniversary, our center's 20th anniversary, a very dear colleague and mentor and friend from Oxford, Professor Vesna Wallace, whom I met, I think, back in 2008. And when she had taken up the professorship of Buddhist studies at Oxford University. And it was a great honor for me to meet her back then when I was still doing my doctorate and learn so much from her and from her expertise in Indian Buddhism. And today it's a great occasion that she's able to be with us and present on a very fascinating topic of a transnational Dharma protector, a Dharmapala. But before we start on this, I'd like to give a brief introduction on our speaker. Vesna Wallace is a professor of South Asian and Inner Asian Buddhist traditions in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on Indian Buddhism, Advanced Sanskrit, and Mongolian Buddhism. She has authored 8 books and countless articles and book chapters on diverse aspects of Indian and Mongolian Buddhist traditions. She is also affiliate faculty in Translation Studies program and in Medical Humanities and Disabilities program at the University of California at Santa Barbara. She served on many international editorial and advisory boards and is currently the executive director of Mongolia Foundation in the US and the vice president of the International Buddhist Congress with headquarters in Delhi. So I could go on to say more, but I think you can find out more about Professor Wallace on the web. I'm sure there's a lot of information. So today she will be talking to us about a very interesting topic about a Dharma protector, where we can see here Begtse and how he has transferred from one region to another. So please give her a warm welcome.
Well, thank you to the Center for Buddhist Studies for hosting me nicely, and thank you all for coming. It's always a pleasure to come here and see old friends and meet the new ones. So before I begin my presentation, maybe just a very brief background how I came up to this topic for tonight. I was working on a book which was focused on imagination and the power of mental and visual images in Buddhism and how it plays in the interplay between text, image, and ritual. And first I thought I will introduce this Begtse into that book, but later I decided not to. And one reason was because all other materials that I was looking at had a practice of imagination and visualization going in a very different direction into being productive of not only of experience, but productive of a particular type of knowledge. So Begtse didn't fit into that category, but I didn't want to just, after I spent some time looking at the material about Begtse, I didn't want to ignore him completely. So I decided I will prepare a lecture and prepare an article on him. But Begtse is very popular in Mongolia, and since this is also an area where I do my research, I then decided to still keep him as a part of my research. So this paper has 2 goals. One is to show, as I mentioned, it was mentioned somewhere on a flyer, is to show that in the process of a transmission, of Tantric Buddhism from one culture to another, Tantric deities often undergo multivariant configurations as their lineages of their transmissions grow in numbers and as legends of their origins and their religious and social roles and ritual practices expand. One such deity is exactly this, fierce deity, widely known in Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhist traditions under the names of Jamsring or Jamsran or Begtse Brother-and-Sister. Another goal, which is kind of indirectly in part of this presentation, is to demonstrate Buddhist understanding of the creative power of imagination and visual images to create new experiences. And therefore, what we imagine matters. Now, let me give you a little bit of background for those of you who are not familiar with this deity. And because he comes under many different names, has a different legends of his own, there are different languages of how he originated, and it has own textual history as well. So Jamsran falls into two main categories of deities. One is a Buddhist war deity, which it seems, according to some lineages, some traditions, begin as a mundane spirit deity, and the other is enlightened Dharma Protector, whose fierce nature and violent actions have been directed towards the mundane and spiritual pragmatic ends. As a result, then many texts dedicated to Jamsran, I use word Mongolian word, sorry, instead of Jamsran. Jamsran begin with an homage to either Hayagriva or Yamar. No, this is still Jamsran. We will come back to these images later. Oh, where are they? Yeah. So I will talk a little bit later about this. But so all of this began with an homage to either Hayagriva or Yamaraja. In Mongolian Buddhism, Jamsran is popularly known as a red protector, and here is a Yamaraj. Is included into a group of 10 fierce Dharma protectors, such as Yamantaka, Vajrapani, Yamaraja, six-armed Mahakala, Sri Devi, Vaishravana, Brahma, white Mahakala, and four-faced Mahakala. In Tibet and Mongolia, he's also dressed as yakṣa, brother and sister. Now, if you look in Vajrapani or other kind of fierce deities, they oftentimes are associated with yakṣa clans. And so is this red protector, who is also in Mongolia called the Red Lord of Life, Vajrabhairava, and so on. He's also given the epithets as a lotus dancer or as a murderer of the 10 bodhisattva grounds, due to having attained the 10th bodhisattva ground, which is, as you know, all of you here, it is an apex of Mahayana path. And because of this, he also bears the name of the 10th bodhisattva ground, so he's given the name of Dharmamekha, or the clouds of dharmas. He's a deity that accomplishes the degrees of other fierce deities, all of which are the 10th stage bodhisattvas, namely Hayagriva, Yamantaka, Black Yamaraja, Mahadeva, and Ekajati, who is a protector of secret mantras and Buddhist teachings. In the Tibetan Sakya, Kagyu, and Nyingma traditions, Jamsran is the main protector of the Hayagriva cycle of practice, and this association with Hayagriva also extends to the Mongolian Gelug tradition. In the Gelug tradition, he's commonly associated with Yamantaka and Mahakala. As a result, many texts dedicated to Jamsran are found in minor collections or of works dedicated to Jamsran and known as Jamsran Beubum. Okay, I'll go back there. So popularity of Jamsran as a Dharma protector in both Tibetan and Mongolian forms of Buddhism is evidenced by the preponderance of prayers, sadhanas, and ritual texts related to this fierce deity. special copies of Jamsran Beubum, or these smaller collections, were traditionally kept in a sealed box. I'm talking now about Mongolia. I would like later to hear how it was in Tibet. While the others were wrapped in a cloth and sealed with the 3 seals, marked at the end of the text with 3 symbolic syllables, gya, 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 and called the seal of entrustment, the seal of concealment, and the seal of disguisement. The sealed collection is orally then transmitted from a teacher to only one trustworthy disciple, as indicated by the colophons to nearly all the texts contained in these minor collections to Jamsran. These were received through oral transmissions due to their secret nature. Some texts trace their transmissions all the way back to Padmasambhava, the 11th century Marpa-Lotsava, and others. The text titled A History of the Red Yakṣa tells us that the secrecy of these texts is due to the power of sadhana practices on Jamsran and his attendants or companions, which results in the practitioner's ability to kill out others by merely glancing at them or by getting angry at them. For instance, we are told that the Indian non-Buddhist master who used to practice evil mantras, by name Acharya Nima Drakpa, or in Sanskrit it will be Chandra Yashas or Chandra Kirti, who is said to have killed others in an instant by merely looking at them. Likewise, his son, Pandita Davanakpo, or Krishna Chandra, killed others in an instant by merely getting angry at them. In later years, one Nyanglotsava became renowned for the same ability due to meditating on the assassins or butchers, Shenpa, of the red Prana Atma, this Lord of Life, a protector of the assistants of the 4-faced Mahakala. After several generations, then the transmission passed to Tibet, culminating with Nyangchu Lotsava, who also became renowned for evil mantras. So out of a concern that powerful ritual practices related to Jamsran may fall into the hands of evil people, then Buddhist tantric masters of the past were instructed to pass that knowledge only to initiate whose intention was to save sentient beings, especially at the time of the decline of the Buddha Dharma, and to prevent the prevalence of those who are inimical to Buddhism. The secret nature then of this Jamsran Beubum is also emphasized by the assertion that it dwells in the very heart of the red Mahakala. Now let me tell a few legends. Let me go back to Jamsran because I will later say more, especially this tanka here. So different accounts of Jamsran's origin indicate his disparate identities. In one legend, he was already a 10th ground bodhisattva who originally resided in Tushita heaven before taking birth from a red egg. According to another legend, he came into existence on account of his future parents' prayers to Maheshwara and Ekajati, for which reason he is also considered to be the accomplisher of the degrees of these 2 deities. The legend says that at the time when Jamsran was to descend from the Tushita heaven into his land of Maruche, the 2 eggs, one coral egg, another agate egg, appeared, from which 2 children were born to their father Yakṣa and mother Bimones. So Begtse emerged from the red coral egg, whereas his sister came from the agate egg. And because of the redness of his egg, his manifestation became that of a fierce yakṣa. Those of you who are familiar with Vajrayana Buddhism, you know that red color always symbolizes power and strength and fierceness. In another legend, we find a somewhat different version of his origin. According to this version, a long time ago, the 2 eggs that soared to the sky and tamed the 8 deities. They pacified the 8 planets in the intermediate directions, then leaping downward, they pacified the 8 great nagas, spirits of the earth, and so on. Then in fear, the father prayed to Maheshwara and Ekajati. After Maheshwara and Ekajati tamed the eggs, Jamsran emerged from this coral egg, and from the agate egg emerged his sister. But when questioned by Maheshwara and Ekajati about his emanations, his residence, and his share of food, Jamsran replied that he is an emanation of Yamantaka speech, and that his abode is a palace of Maruche, which is red copper plain in the northwestern direction of Jambudvipa. As for the share of my food, he said, it is a field of destruction. The red-faced daughter answered the same question posed to her by Ekajati, saying, I am an emanation of the speech of matrikas or mamos, of fierce mother deities. And my name is Red-Faced Rikwehlamo, a powerful lady of a secret dance. And my residence is in the northeastern direction. And after that, then Ekajati bestowed empowerment on those 2, offered her heart's blood to each of them, and extracted an oath from them to protect the Buddha Dharma. And from then on, then they have protected the Dharma in India and in the countries of Hashan and Li. Protecting the teachings of India, they transformed themselves into yakshas. In the Hashan country of China, they transformed themselves into war deities, and in the country of Li, they turned into the bodyguards of the cycle of teachings. Indian masters who held tenets different of those of the Buddha Dharma and who intended to brutally harm others hid this in the Indian terma, or hidden, as you know, hidden treasures. So the Mongolian folk tradition contains different oral accounts concerning Jamsran. So according to one account, Jamsran and Rikwehlamo are said to be each other's consorts, not brothers and sisters, and the parents of the 8 red assistants or butchers who follow Jamsrans in every battle. So there are many different stories, but I won't bother you with this long legends, because, as I said, they have many legends that come from this Beubum that seems to have originated maybe in Tibet, and then also separate stories that come from Mongolia. So let me talk a little bit about these Jamsran's transcultural identities and function. In a text that is contained in Jamsran Beubum entitled The Exhortation of the Essence of the Retinue of this Red Lord of Life, Jamsran is described as a transcultural deity that manifests with different identities and carries out different tasks in different regions of Asia, as ones that I already have just mentioned. He's invoked as a transgressor spirit of India, war deity in the land of Hashan, a protector of the gods of Maruche, the great guardian spirit of the Dharma in the country of Li, a military officer of the Matrikas in Tibet, a minister of the Legion of 1,000 yakshas, the chief of all yakshas with a copper ritual dagger. With a sword in his right hand, he destroys the life of those who violate their religious commitments or pledges, samayas. On the right side of Jamsran is Lohita Prana Atma. I don't know whether lighting prohibits you well to see him, but Prana Atma is similar to Jamsran in appearance as a warrior wearing an armor and riding a rabid wolf. Can you see him? Sometimes. Oh, he's on the left. Let's see. He's here. So it's hard to kind of see because of lighting. And Pranatma holds a lasso and the head of an adversary in his hand, and with his right hand he holds a spear. In this and other ritual sadhanas, as well as in iconography like here, Jamsran is visualized and iconographically represented as having a red body and a red face with 3 eyes spinning and blazing. Again, red color is this color of power, right? And having a mouth showing the 4 fangs, like almost all fierce deity show that, right? His head is decorated with 5 human skulls. He wields a fiery sword with his right hand, and with his left hand, he holds the bow and arrow. He carries a victory banner under his armpit. Let's see if other are better. Okay, here you can see a victory banner, right? Let's see, there. He wears it under his armpit. I'll go back to other one because we will talk soon about someone else. On the left side of Jamsran is his sister, Rikperlamo, riding a mad bear. Her body is dark blue. Can you see her? And her red face has 3 eyes and semi-open mouth with the 4 fangs. She wields a scorching sword with her right hand, and with her left hand, she holds a ritual dagger. On the right side of Jamsran is also Sogdaka, I've already mentioned, sorry. Here, like in many other practices of imagination, although the yogi knows that the visual imagery that he is creating in meditation is unreal, nevertheless, the imagination and visual imagery become productive, and we will see soon how they become productive. Jamsran is also accompanied by 8 assistants who carry daggers, and by 21 assassins, sometimes they are called butchers, who wear the wet skin of their enemies. And you can see some of them on the bottom of Tanka. The assassins wield the dagger in their right hand, and with their left hand, they hold the enemy's liver, heart, lung, spleen, eyes, marrow, and the scalp with hair. They perform grisly tasks. I will not mention them because I don't want you to have nightmares. Trampling the ground with their feet and jumping and leaping as they dance. There are also numerous armies consisting of 1,000 evil spirits who race in front of Jamsran and hurl red lasso at the enemy. On his right side, there are 1,000 black demons who cut the enemies whose tantric pledges deteriorated. On Jamsran's left side, there are 100,000 matrikas who give blood diseases and the like to the enemy. Behind him, there are 1,000 crawling assassins who cut off the life of the enemies of Dharma. And around him, in the 10 directions, are thousands of yakshas who take the life of hostile yogis, while the billions of divisions of his murderous devils display various supernatural powers and disturb the 3 worlds. And together with their messengers and others, they all squash the enemies of Dharma. They wield fiery swords with handles in the shape of scorpions, and they hold the esophagus and the heart of the enemy. And here too, you can see Jamsran holding a heart of an enemy. Of course, we will talk soon, there are other meanings to this image. So this is all what a yogi will visualize when meditating on Jamsran at the times of crisis, at the time when Buddha Dharma is threatened. These terrifying images of Jamsran, his army, and his realm of Maruche, which are visualized by the yogi who invokes them and incites them to violent action, empower the yogi to overcome external enemies, whether ritually or in an actual war, battle. For such a yogi, the described images are not simply metaphor for the elimination of negative mental states, but also conduit to victory over the external enemies of Dharma. As an archetype of a mighty and fierce warrior who can also be compassionate to his worshippers. And to those who keep their pledges, Jamsran is put into both military service as well as into the service of accomplishing various tasks of a protector deity. Some of the duties that are assigned to him are those of protecting the worshipper from common dangers like, bad weather, the illness, and so on. For example, in a short text titled, actually, it's not titled, it's composed by the sixth Panchen Lama, Lobsang Palden. The Panchen Lama addresses Jamsran as a devourer of the three worlds, commands him and his companions to smash a gang of bandits and create favorable conditions, such as freedom from the dangers of human and non-humans, famine, epidemics, and so on. The fierce nature of Jamsran and his assistants and the violent tasks that they are expected to perform are reflected not only in their fierce appearance, but also in the violent nature of their rituals. These incorporate mantras of killing as well as fierce offerings such as tormas containing the blood and the flesh of a goat, a dog, or a fox. Moreover, Jamsran and his wrathful army also grant blessings, as we find in a number of texts which are called Jamsran's benedictions, where Jamsran is identified with Manjushri, in addition to being identified as an emanation of Yamantaka, who is a fierce aspect of Manjushri. So Jamsran is also praised in other texts as an emanation of Amitābha by way of being identified as an emanation of Hayagriva, who is a fierce aspect of Amitābha. So through transformations of Jamsran, we also have these transformations of Buddhas and 10 stage of Bodhisattvas. So let me say a little bit about the worship of Jamsran in Mongolia. In works composed by Mongolian authors, we encountered Jamsran as a tertiary manifestation of the Buddha Amitābha by virtue of being an emanation of Mahakala. So in the 17th century chronicle called the Precious Summary, we read that when the third Dalai Lama was on his way to Hohenor to meet with Altan Han, he made a Torma offering to the very powerful Begtse Mahakala, who listens to the command of Hayagriva. And reminding him of the duties as a Dharma protector and instructing him how to follow the Dharma, the third Dalai Lama dispatched him to subjugate the deities and Nagas of the Mongol lands, who would be otherwise inimical to the Buddha Dharma. So that night, when he arrived at the banks of the Gun River, all the spirits, deities, Nagas, demons, and shamanic spirits of the Mongol land were brought under his control. At this time, he bound them all with the vow to serve the Dharma. Then, while Mongol nobles, accompanied by the 3,000 people, were welcoming him with many offerings, the third Dalai Lama appeared, manifested to them as a four-armed Avalokiteshvara. The next day, while he was traveling on his horse, the six-syllable mantra of Mani Padme Hum appeared on the stone on the path trod by his chestnut horse. Seeing that, everybody present developed great faith. This is what this chronicle says. Later, Mongol Abbatai Senhan of Halha began to worship Jamsran as his protector and Vajrapani as his yidam in Western Palace. And Western Palace is very important for the Mongols because it became a central fire hearth place of a Mongol state, and it has its origin to the time of Chinggis Khan. So during Abbatai Khan's rule, Mongolian officials and nobles swore an oath to Jamsran every year. And Abbatai Khan, after Abbatai Khan's worship, the tradition of worshipping Jamsran was passed then to the first Jetsundamba Ondergegen Zanabazar, who was to Mongols, what Dalai Lama is to Tibetans, and sequentially to his later incarnations. Soon after the establishment of the autonomous Boksan state in 1911, the eighth Jetsu Damba, the eighth incarnation of Zanabazar, together with his queen, lit the ceremonial fire on the morning of the first day of Mongolian year in that Western palace. And it was there, in front of the image of Jamsran, that the state ministers, officials, and noblemen took an oath to wholeheartedly serve the Mongol state. Similarly, in 1903, at the establishment of the 30th Division of Ikhure, which was a capital at the time of Mongolia, dedicated to the queen, known as Dakini division, an image of Jamsran was placed in the queen's temple for her protection. From 1919 to 1924, the Mongolian Ministry of Defense worshipped Jamsran until the Mongolian People Revolutionary Party joined the Comintern, worshipped as a war deity with his extraordinary ability and terrifying power, and he was worshipped with offerings, asked for the help to all beings, and he became the protector of the Mongolian Ministry of Defense, summoned a peace with offerings, and asked to secure the peace of the country and subjugate the enemy, causing obstacles to the state. Jamsran's activities in Mongolia also played out through his medium, renowned, just a second, okay, here. These are some of the offerings to Jamsran. You can see tormas, and I'll talk more about these offerings. Yeah, here. So, as I mentioned, Jamsran's activity in Mongolia played out through his medium, renowned military general and leading figure in Mongolia's fight for independence from the Qing Empire. His name was Khatan Batar Maksarjav, who fought against the Qing army. It is said that prior to leaping into the battle, Maksarjav entered a trance and then while in trance, brandished his gun and a sword. And it is said that within that trance state, his sword leaped out from its scabbard by itself, and bullets would leap out from their compartments. And having become transformed into this ferocious warrior endowed with cities and the knowledge when and how to launch the offensive, he instilled confidence in his soldiers and was successful in every battle he waged. And it was a battle at the Hovd, which was still the last frontier which Qing had yet occupied and was not freed by the Mongols. So in 1912, together with other military leaders, Maksarjav led the army with several thousand men into the city of Hovd, the last bastion of the Qing army. And prior to entering battle, together with Jalhan Hotakt, whose current incarnation is considered the Jamsran oracle, and some of you have met it when you visited Mongolia, you recognize him. And his disciple Maksarjav meditated on fierce activities, and he participated in the ritual of expelling the enemy. After joining the Mongolian Revolutionary Party in 1921, he fought White Russian troops led by ultra-conservative monarch Baron Ungern, who used to intimidation and brutality toward the revolutionaries. So due to his bravery and victory in battle, then Maksarjav received the honorary title of Khatan Batar, which means, in translation, strong hero, from the Jetsu Damba, and the rank of a prince. A year after joining the Mongolian Revolutionary in 1922, he was appointed as a Minister of Defense, and so that worship of Jamsran was still secretly carried out there. According to one account, at one occasion, when Maksarjav sent some of his men to spy on the Qing military encampment, a soldier returned unnerved by the sight of the size of the troops. And because of that, Maksarjav entered a trance, and while in trance, he beat his soldiers with a whip. After the trance, then he instilled the confidence in his men by recounting his vision of Chinggis Khan while in trance and assuring them that the Jamsran is watching over them. In another account describing Maksarjav's dealing with the killed enemy, it is said that after beheading the enemy, cutting his chest open and taking out enemy's heart, Maksarjav worshipped his flag with the enemy's heart and had his soldier taste the blood dripping from it. This is something that Chinggis Khan army was doing. This was a kind of common practice at the time in the 13th century by Mongol army anyway. So he didn't invent it, but he kind of brought this practice into this practice with Maksarjav, who is, as we have seen him, having this heart of an enemy close to his mouth. So Jamsran has been also object of ritual worship in Mongolia at various mountain sites, worships, stone cairns, and temples played a great, important part in ritual mask dances held at various monasteries. Oh, I'll come back to this, sorry. Jamsran mask, which was used in a mask dance performance in Ihure, held in the early 1930s, was made approximately of 6,000 coral beads and weighed 70 kilograms at the end of the 19th century. It was made at the end of 19th century by well-known artists of Ihure. So even today, I think when you went to Choji Lama's museum, you were able to see the mask, right? Now, in Mongolian writings, various texts that are related to Jamsran, such as supplicatory and confessional prayers and eulogies, ritual texts of exorcism, continue to be produced in Mongolia until 1921. The earlier mentioned Jetsudamba, the first Jetsudamba, under Gegenzana Bazar, composed a versified prayer of offerings to Jamsran in the Tibetan language, in which he addresses Jamsran as a fierce deity risen from the dance of primordial wisdom of the greatly powerful Buddha Amitābha. Thus, for him, Jamsran is not a mundane deity converted to Buddhism, but a manifestation of the Buddha. In his prayer, Zanabazar offers to Jamsran, and now I'll go back. Now you will see spiritual meanings. That image of Jamsran has both mundane and spiritual. Okay, let's see. Oh, here. Sorry. No, this. Well, maybe this one is clearer to look at, this little tsatsa. So, for him, Jamsran, as I said, is not just a mundane deity. Now the prayer of offerings will now actually describe the other kind of symbolism of Jamsran's image. He offers, in this prayer, Zanabazar offers to Jamsran hand a mighty sword representing the blazing fire of wisdom, a bow standing for a sublime method and similar to the Vajra rock, an arrow of wisdom, a victory flag, an ocean of nectar of stainless wisdom, the offering substances, ornaments, and garments of pure ethical conduct, a coat of mail representing fearless patience, boots representing indefatigable effort, and the cushion of a corpse representing unwavering meditative concentration. So everything is sublimated in this prayer. Okay, maybe I can bring you back to this main image. To the hands of the goddess Rikpe Halmo, he offers a blazing ritual dagger of meteoric iron, which cuts the enemies and destroys obstacles, and he offers her a fast-running bear. To the hand of the red Sogdak, he offers a mad wolf that leaps swiftly like lightning, a copper-colored banner, and a red lasso that abolishes the hordes of Maras. While weaponizing these three deities for the destruction of outer enemies, Zanabazar also sublimates their weapons in accordance with Jamsran's ultimately sublime nature, one that pacifies and purifies. So from his, that purifies yogi, here Zanabazar, from his mental afflictions. So each verse of Zanabazar's prayer is followed by a refrain which begins, if you accept it, offerings, right, and ends with a command to this oath-bound protector to carry out all of these tasks, namely to cut, pierce, disperse those who scorn the Buddhist teachings and holders of the Buddhist teachings, to vanquish Zanabazar's own mental afflictions and obstacles, to expand the Buddhist teachings in the 10 directions, to increase the happiness of all beings, and to bestow good fortune to teachers, disciples, and patrons, so that all may accomplish their own benefit and that of others. It is evident from these words of prayer that Zanabazar was familiar not only with iconographical representation of Jamsran, but also with the symbolic meaning of the Jamsran's implements. Zanabazar presents his offerings to Jamsran in a reciprocal or transactional manner. If Jamsran, as an oath-bound protector, accepts the offering, then he is in turn expected to follow the given injunctions, in the same way as the nature spirits like Nagas and so on, right? The mundane deities, when the offerings are made, something is always asked in return from them. They're expected to do something in return. So this is very interesting. In one hand, he's this emanation of Amitābha. On another hand, he is basically expected to do after being compensated with offerings, so to speak. In various Mongolian prayers, we find statements that appeal to previously mentioned two aspects of Jamsran's nature and activity. In the summonings, on the one hand, Jamsran is asked to come from the upper realm, from the primordially pure Dharmatatu, this absolute space of ultimate reality or emptiness, and to manifest in a fierce appearance in order to accomplish the task. And on the other hand, he's addressed as this greatly ferocious demon from among the quarreling demons and devils. That's how he's even referred to. So this juxtaposition of Jamsran as both a deity abiding in this primordially pure Dharmadhatu and as a greatly fierce spirit that dwells with quarreling demons and devils in the land of Maruche remains unexplained in Mongolian writing. But it seems that it is to be taken for granted, or it is taken for granted, that Jamsran's nature and activities should be understood from the ultimate point of view that breaks down dualities and negates all conceptions, a view in which there is no real difference between a yakṣa spirit and a highly realized bodhisattva. And this juxtaposition also appears in references to Jamsran's abode in the land of Maruche and his quadrangular palace with 4 gates made of human skulls, which you have seen in passing. The palace rests in the center of a terrifying land of Maruche, where the sky is covered by red clouds from which emerge the roaring sounds of dragons, flashes of lightning, and showers of blood. There, the sounding strikes of raining iron spears and swords reverberate, and the blows that smash the skulls of the enemy appear. The copper mountain of Maruche mountains are filled with internal organs of oath-breakers and are surrounded by the ocean of blood formed from the blood of enemies and animals. This is a place where dreadful and inauspicious birds, such as owls, fly across the mountain valley and whose wings produce a frightening sound. So everything is terrifying. And that is again something that yogi visualizes when invoking Jamsran from the land of Maruche into the battle. This reference to the presence of owls in Jamsran's Maruche land is also reason for which owl became associated with esoteric rituals related to Jamsran, and why 13 owls were included in the ritual offerings. In some Jamsran-related rituals, the red torma and red poisonous arrows, sprinkled with the blood and decorated with the feathers of owl, are also represented to increase the ferocity of ritual efficacy. However, as previously noted, Jamsran abode is also the upper realm of primordially pure Dharmatatu. Well, this suggests that this dreadful land of Maruche, just like Jamsran himself, is to be understood as nothing more than a mere appearance, devoid of substantiality. From this perspective, the dual identities of Jamsran's nature and his dwelling place are not mutually contradictory. Until Jamsran is invoked and summoned in prayers and rituals, he remains a mere potential for violence. But when ritually invoked, internalized through meditation and incited into an action, he becomes a powerful ally who can take on the form of a yakṣa spirit or be embodied in a human warrior, like Maksarjav. In many writings dedicated to Jamsran, he never acts on his own initiative, but performs the task through persuasion, summoning, and offerings, or when impelled by the mind of other Dharma protectors and Buddhas. Hence, he can be summoned and brought forth in meditation or in prayer in various ways. In this minor collection of texts related to Jamsran, there appear two common methods of summoning him. One is by summoning him directly from the land of Maruche, and the other involves bringing him from the heart of Hayagriva into one's own heart in meditation. Likewise, in correspondence with red, blazing color of Jamsran body and his land of Maruche, a meditation of Jamsran is said to have the best results if practiced in the red region or in a place where there are red stones or on a mountainside. But it can be also practiced in a cremation ground, burial ground, at the confluence of rivers, in a temple, monasteries, or in a palace. In addition to performing the activities of expelling nagas, demons, spirit landowners, and enemies of Dharma, Jamsran is also deemed capable of performing the tasks that support tantric yogis, the tantric rites of pacification and prosperity or long life rituals. This is why also he's called the Lord of Life. In his poem called He, the famous Mongolian yogi of the 19th century by name Danzan Ravja, you have learned about him when you visited his Shambhala land, who became an orphan in early age, praises Jamsran as a deity who supports orphans, who treats them with compassion, and who prevents theft. So this versatility of Jamsran's activities reflects the condensation of responses to different needs by different groups of people into single deity. Part yakṣa spirit, part divine, Jamsran embodies this multifaceted nature, while ultimately not being established anywhere. The question of a doctrinal support for the existence of the simultaneous mundane and enlightened identities and activities of such a deity answered only implicitly in a text. They suggest that it is possible for the deity's different identities to coexist at the same time because they lack a reified ontological basis. It seems that the Buddhist doctrine of the absence of the inherent nature allows for Jamsran to be culturally and religiously adaptable to different pragmatic ends, social and religious, assigned to him in different circumstances by Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhist tantric adepts. Jamsran's dual identity seems to be programmatically recreated to accomplish two types of activities. One that is suitable for a fierce mundane deity that can intervene and rearrange social events and circumstances with any means necessary, and the other that is compassionate and supportive of those in need. So let me just conclude that as revealed by various ritual texts dedicated to Jamsran, the frightening aspect of Jamsran's image is at times interpreted semiotically as a representation of one's own inner exorcism, in which the enemy's heart, held in a Jamsran's hands, is interpreted as one's own ego grasping and one's own mental afflictions. And at other times, Jamsran's violent activities are taken quite literally. His cruel deeds are justified in two ways. One is that he harms sentient beings in order to help them, for which reason he is called the Lord of Life. And the other way is that his harsh deeds are justified by the idea that those sentient beings upon him inflict harms or even death become purified through that from their negative karma, and in this way obtain a favorable rebirth. So when it comes then back to practices of visualization and power of visualized images, I will just briefly conclude. There's so much more to talk about visualization. Visualized images really can be looked as a site for shared religious and symbolic forms, which are inextricable from the historical events and social circumstances in which they are created. So rituals are not only doctrinally shaped, but also socially. Although the act of imagining Jamsran, his attendants, and Maruche is conceptual, contemplative practices, these contemplative practices, it is not rationalizing analytical process that assesses whether that which is visualized is real or a mere metaphor. The main concern here is that it is efficacious. So I'll end here. Sorry if I went a little bit too long. It's late, 7 o'clock. You probably all had dinner and ready to rest, but you've been patient, so thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions or comments, something that you would like to add. Some of these things are kind of applicable to other fierce Dharma protectors, so it's not unique, but what is unique is deity role of Amitābha and Avalokiteshvara and Manjushri.
Yes, thank you very much, Vesna, for this fascinating presentation. It's true that there is a lot of conflicting or almost contradictory characteristics about Jamsran. And, well, you know, usually we think of Dharma protectors in a much more conventional sense of, you know, either for protecting the Dharma and the practitioners against the mishappenings, as you mentioned, or apotropeically, to, you know, to kind of remind us as Buddhist practitioners that if we were to violate our samaya, our promises, or use the Dharma for selfish means, that there are consequences. So it's really, in some sense, it's an image out of the hell realms, right? That a practitioner might actually end up if he or she doesn't really abuse the Dharma for their own selfish ways. But I think what is very perplexing about what you presented, and I'm wondering if this is just a Mongolian or I don't know if it's also in Tibetan context, do you have this kind of contradictions also in Tibet?
Right. I think you do. Although what it seems to me that maybe you can tell us more, right? Because you know better how it's done in Tibet. But what I have heard from Mongolian lamas, the Jamsran is really worshipped more like a Buddha in Mongolia, where I'm not sure that is necessarily the case in Tibet. So, but it is interesting, like you can't invoke Avalokiteshvara or Manjushri into the battle. So you have to either kind of
Transform them.
transform him into something else to be able to utilize that power, right?
But in some ways, one would argue this goes really against the Buddha Dharma, right? The very principles of ahimsa, non-violence, benevolence, compassion, right?
Yeah.
So I think in the mind of some of the of people who might actually, for the first time, be exposed to this kind of imagery and concepts, the question would be, how does this really belong? Does it even belong to Buddhism, or is it something extraneous that was somehow absorbed into Buddhist practices when in its, or when actually it belongs to a more shamanic milieu or a non-Buddhist context?
Very good question. And it seems, according to several texts that talk about the history of the lineage of Jamsran, tracing it back to India, they say that it was initially heterodox, non-Buddhist practice, and that it was used for evil, with evil intentions. And so it's almost as if Buddhism appropriates it and then tries to transform it to a certain degree, right? While also preserving this powerful, violent nature when it's needed for the protection of Dharma. So it's not to be used for against anybody. That's why that was kept, this Beubum is kept so secretive and not allowed, transmitted only orally, at least in Mongolia, until recently when they just published everything.
Thank you very much.
I just have a following questions. Do you think there is a strong connection between this god yakṣa and the India idea of Mahakala?
Right.
Because in the Chinese description, this Mahakala is a god of war.
Yeah,
and there are so many connections with the war. And it's purely an Indian god, as a Hindu god, according to the Chinese.
Yeah, right.
It's not Buddhist, but transmitted to Chinese Buddhism along with Buddhism.
Right.
But of course, this Mahakala never became a prominent god in Chinese Buddhism. Always played marginal roles. But here, it seems a very important god.
Yes,
it
Mahakala
plays several different kind of roles.
Four-armed Mahakala is very important for Mongolia from very early on, and he's a protector of many monasteries, one of the main deity protectors. I think when you visited Erdenzu Monastery, maybe you saw on the upper room image of a white four-armed Mahakala, right, as a protector. Yeah, Mahakala was very early on very important figure for Mongols. Also there is something with Mongolian warrior mentality that this fierce deity resonates to that mentality, and they like this idea of deities being powerful, not just being like a soft, compassionate being, but then there is this reinterpretation, right? That this violence will bring some benefit, even to those who are killed. That somehow their karma is purified and through that. So that is still kind of a fierce aspect of a Buddha's compassionate activity. I know what you think.
Thank you, Professor. My question is somewhat related to Professor Guangxin's question. Jamsran being transnational, having such an important role in Mongolian Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, I just wonder if it has any peaceful manifestation in Chinese Buddhism or any of the Dharmapalas or maybe in Southeast Asia.
No, never. I never in a peaceful. Never, yeah, it's always this very fierce. But what is interesting that going back to these practices of imagination, right? That somehow not only through this ritual recitation of violent mantras, but that also through this visualization, one creates a different reality. not only for oneself, but for the entire environment. And as you, I think, one of you indicated that in certain social circumstances, such a deity becomes prevalent, or need is looked for such a deity that will have a power, right? And then how do you justify, if not through this association with enlightened beings?
Or archetypes. Could it
Yeah.
also, one could give a Jungian interpretation
Exactly.
that is really an archetype of our own violent nature, which needs to be sublimated and subjugated and transformed.
Right. But when you read some of these rituals, they are really, really violent. It's hard, then you have to, sorry? No? Oh, okay, I thought Christina maybe wanted to say something or ask. Yes, Nico.
Thank you so much, Professor. I had a couple of questions actually. So the first one was, I think, and did I hear this right, that when you were talking about the general in the first part of the 20th century, he had after doing the sadhana of Jamsran, he had a vision of Chinggis Khan.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So is there a connection in Mongolian culture, but specifically between Chinggis Khan and Jamsran, or do people have visions of Chinggis Khan all the time, or So that was
very good question. No, there is a connection in Mongolia between Chinggis Khan and Vajrapani. Chinggis Khan is considered to be an emanation of Vajrapani, and Vajrapani is a protector of Mongol state. And Jamsran at the times is also protector of Mongol state, but they are worshipped as two separate deities. So, but it is very interesting that it was actually by revolutionaries, and for those who were in the army with Maksarjav, who report that he saw vision of Chinggis Khan. And I think because Chinggis Khan stands as a symbol in Mongolia, symbol of power, a symbol of kind of how they see it as a just war, right? And a symbol of Mongolian national identity. And even today, you go to Mongolia, like every place you will see images of Chinggis Khan is everywhere, from baby's milk to vodka to international airports, hotels, restaurants, everything is called Chinggis Khan, right? It's like a very auspicious name and a powerful name. So we don't know whether he really saw it or not, but at least it was enough to say to the soldiers, to give them this courage and confidence to engage in a battle with troops that are much bigger in number and to conquer them.
Thank you. And my second question was about the sectarian identity of Jamsran, because sometimes these Dharma protectors in a worldly sense are connected to protecting one sect and even sometimes associated with having negative attitudes towards other sects. Does Jamsran have that sort of connotation, a sort of Gaelic sectarianism?
No, because also he, as I mentioned, in Sakya, Nima, and Kagyu, he's recognized as an emanation of Hayagriva. So no, everybody accepts Jamsran. Everybody needs sometimes powerful ally.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's not the same like Shukten or no. Any other questions or comments? But again, going back to this juxtaposition, right? That's why I said the only way to explain it is that he's only potential, right? That can be brought into existence, but ultimately has no ontological basis, right?
Well, what is very perplexing is in Tibetan Buddhism, they usually divide them into mundane protectors and supramundane. And the mundane are not enlightened protectors,
Exactly.
they're worldly deities that are used for worldly means. And then you have the supramundane, like Mahakala, which actually becomes, in the Tibetan, a supramundane. It's actually an emanation of a Buddha. But here with Jamsran, there seems to be no clear division between
No, no.
if he's a mundane or a super mundane.
He's like both,
He's like
right?
both.
He acts as a mundane when you need him in a battle, in a war, and he's also
A super mundane deity. So there's some maybe in the Mongolian psyche, or is this a cultural thing, or do you think that is we could use Mongolian Buddhism in a way to interpret that they can deal with this kind of let's just put it contradiction,
Yeah.
if you will, without feeling that they need to resolve it. Whereas within a more Tibetan Buddhist context, they feel they have to draw the line and say, okay, those are mundane deities, those are super mundane, and
Right.
actually warning you not to really propitiate mundane deities
right.
and really work with super mundane,
Yeah.
because at the end, the soteriological goal of Buddhism is to attain awakening and
Right.
enlightenment. So
Yeah, you may be right.
sidetracked,
Exactly. So it's possible very much that this is a Mongolian way, because if Chinggis Khan can be Vajrapani, right, then why Jamsran cannot be Mahakala or Amitābha or Manjushri or Lokiteshvara, right, all of that. Same way. It's very difficult to clearly answer the question. Reason is that version of from Tibet, version of Beubum is not allowed to see. I could only see a table of contents, but when I compared table of contents with that that comes from Mongolia, only 3 texts seem to bear the same title. And the Mongolian Beubum is much larger than one from Spiti. So I could see for maybe almost 10 or 20 more, no, more than 20 texts are there. So then it's the same text, but they have different titles. It was very difficult when you cannot look at the text itself, then it's very difficult to know for certain whether are they really different, or is it only the 3 texts that are the same and everything is different?
was it in Mongolian or is translated in Mongolian?
No, it was written in Tibetan. So the book contains both Tibetan version and modern Mongolian translations, which are not very comprehensible. Tibetan is easier actually, because sometimes the way how they translate from Tibetan, it's also word by word translation, which makes not always much sense in Mongolian.
It would be a fascinating comparative study
Yeah.
between the Tibetan text and tradition and the Mongolian.
Yeah. As I think monastery would not certainly give just anybody walks in and ask these sealed texts, and even BDRC doesn't feel comfortable to share a text that they have.
So the only collection you have identified in Tibet is the Spiti.
Well, the ones that I'm sure in Tibet there are maybe more, but we don't know, right? They are kept very privately because of the violent nature that can be misused. Some of these texts could be easily misused. So then it's one from Spiti is only available, but then again, it's not really available.
Sorry, I just have one more question.
Sure.
To which Tantra class does Jamsran's sadhana belong to? The Kriya, the Charya, the Anuratara?
Very good. It would probably belong to Kriya. Of course, they don't classify it in that way at all, right? But in terms of activities that he does, you could say it could, because offerings are made. It just like in the Kriya Tantras, exactly. Rituals are very much Kriya Tantra. Yeah, good question. Thank you. I didn't even think in this kind of category, but yeah.
But him being, with the sort of the Buddha status, one could argue that it could be, of a higher tantra.
Right. On the other hand, he's commanded. It's this transactional relationship. It's not like when you come to the Buddhas and you kind of give yourself to their compassion, and this is very different. This is, now I ask you to do this task, right? Mm-hmm. I make you these violent offerings. I didn't mention, but in tormas, different bodily parts, blood, everything is, usually from animals placed in, and vodka, which is always offered to fierce deity, not milk. milk you offer to the peaceful deities, but vodka to fierce deities. So, so you offer this, but then because he's bound by oath to help you, right? So, so it's very interesting also relationship. So if it is ultimately Buddha Amitābha, right? And then, but then you are, okay, I give you gift now, you do this for me, you are bound by an oath to do this for me, right? It's a kind of strange relationship, right?
Yeah.
Because of this dual nature.
Yeah, interesting, yeah.
I'm sure in some other context in Tibet, it would be different, right? Maybe, can you share a little bit? Can you tell us? Don't be shy.
Thank you, Professor. I don't really know about, the Jamsran, but just, we kind of worship him as Dharma Protectors in my community, in my homeland. I was wondering, they have, he has a very different name in Tibetan. One is the Jamsran, as you said. The other is the Wakzi. And there's another name like Chijang Chakwa.
Oh.
Yeah. I was wondering, is there any sort of, historical context about this, these designations that was given to him?
Right. No, nothing that I could see from those ritual texts, right?
Right, and also the Gongsu, he has, when we kind of doing some sort of ritual ceremony about hymns, we often do that kind of Gongsu. I don't know how to translate it into English. I think fulfillment and a supplication or something, right? Yeah. And apart from that, everything about him is kind of very secret. It's very secret, yeah. Because the language that, he used in his text is so strong,
Right.
Normally it's really wrathful. Yeah, we have
I didn't talk about this because I thought it's it's pretty gruesome.
So the information about him is very limited. It's very limited. It's almost like nowhere to get the full pictures of him. Yeah, in my community, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah.
No, thank you for sharing.
Hello, Professor. If I'm not wrong, you mentioned that when a yogi is practicing a jamse or trying to invite him in a meditation, the setting of the practice has some requirements, like it should be in a place where among red stones or in a graveyard, or also which is commonly applied in a monastery. So could you please share with us like the logic behind? In a monastery or in a graveyard, it's pretty common for different Buddhist followers of different schools, but for to practice among red stones, what is the logic behind?
Oh, because this answer could be very long and could be also short, because in Buddhism you have these 5 colors, and each color is associated with certain powers or certain. So red is a color of power, white is a color of pacification, yellow is stabilization, right? Or it's an earth element, and red is a fire element, and so on. And so that if you are visualizing something like this bloody land of Maruche and these red protectors and all those red thousands and thousands of these assassins, that if you are in a red land, not only that it may help, I don't know if it would help on it has any efficacy on visualizing things red. I don't think it has to do with that. It has to do with the power that earth, the lead ground, the lead stone, this red stone will have some in itself certain power. For example, in a certain tantric practices, that certain meditations are done in a different kind of colored ground. For pacification rituals, the best is to do it somewhere where is a light color, right? For practices of paralyzing somebody, right? Then you do it, you use something that is yellow, because yellow is the color of the earth element. And earth element has this cohesion and stability, right? Same comes with water element and so on. So that not only internal, what you visualize, right, colors, but also that which is in the nature, in the elements, has its own, exerts its own efficacy and own power. That's why mandalas, tantric mandalas, which are made out of sand or painted colors, all that colors always represents elements. Earth, water, fire, wind, and space, right? And these elements have their own efficacy and own power that exerts in the environment. That's why if you ever looked in a text that talk about the powers of places or dangers of certain places where you should not build a house or where you should not rest, it's always, in addition to shape of a place, and what is in this place, lots of stones or a little stone or one giant stone and so on. And the color of the place are always related to certain efficacy that not only those shapes, but also colors of that place will exert. And some are good for animals, but bad for humans. Some are good for humans, but bad for animals, and so on.
Hi, sorry. I was wondering because at the start you said that they were transmitted to one particular disciple, right?
Yeah,
For the text.
that's how it was originally. It was only to initiate the disciple that was orally taught. Somebody that, let's say, Acharya, Vajra master, would know that this is somebody who will not misuse these practices, try to harm others simply because doesn't like them or, noisy neighbor.
Yeah.
But for times of crisis when it's important to protect Dharma.
Yep. So did they actually became more popular as Mongolia became more engaged in wars? Is there like a time mapping for that in terms of data?
I don't think it was publicly still shared, but there were certain people. It was interesting. This Maksarja was never the general. He was never a monk, and somehow he has was this oracle of became an oracle of Jamsran, and it seems like naturally
Connected.
Spontaneously reason oracle at this time of crisis. Before, he wasn't known as a Jamsran oracle. And later, he never used these powers, only at that time when they were fighting against the Qing.
Okay. Is it because that they're scared of their own death so that they kind of share this side of this deity so that, they don't have to be afraid of the consequences of the law of karma?
Probably part of that too, but to be an oracle, you really have to be possessed by the by the spirit of the deity. Yeah.
Just one more thing. I was wondering, because you said they've now published all of these texts in Mongolia.
But I don't know.
And do you have any idea why they might have done this, or is there something going on more broadly in Mongolia today about sharing, tantric practices more openly, or is it slightly random that they've published it?
It really makes no sense to me why they publish. They're called Shambhala publication, and it is all, oh, maybe there is some reason, because the Lama who is in the charge, he's a kind of a little bit of Gelugpa, staunch Gelugpa, you know, who doesn't like Nima and so on. I don't know if he practices Shukten or not. I don't know him that well, but he's one who finances publications through these publishers, which is basically, I think, his publisher. So maybe he had some reason, but there was no, yeah, it's not clear why he would have this published. It's not like Mongolia is in some crisis right now, right? But of all things that could be published, he had this whole Beugum published, not just few texts, but very strange. Well, I'm glad he did. At least we get a little bit more sense of this complexity. Who is this deity? You hear all the time about him. His also paintings are everywhere and on aprons, and even, you know, there is an image of that mask, and that mask image of this red protector, as they call it, appears everywhere. And I never knew exactly why, who is he, right? Until I started looking at the text. So I'm glad they did, because I learned something from it, but also it feels a little bit uncomfortable when you read, as he said, very powerful, violent language. Like, wow, never expected that in Buddhism.
Thank you, Professor, for interesting sharing. I'm curious about that. When I saw this image of yakṣa, right? Yeah, like he holding the sword and his deity to guard, to bless for the a battle. And I'm thinking whether is there any symbolized to help or to generate the spirit of practitioner, like that we are as a warrior to in the battle with our defilements and ignorance.
Yeah, that's how that Zanabazar, the first Jetsunama, in a way, interpreted in his prayer, right? When he said, I offer you sword of wisdom. And he said that this sword is not just a sword that goes around killing people in a battle, but also represents wisdom, just like Manjushri's sword, right? So, yeah, so there are these two aspects, right? As I say, sublimated aspect, and then this very mundane, violent aspect as well. Yes, so definitely.
Professor? Yeah, thank you. I have a kind of following question with Venerable. The way Joshua conquers the enemy, like behead the enemy's head, and cutting open the enemy's chest, taking out the enemy's heart, is kind of violent and cruel.
Yeah.
And this way is more like a symbolic way of conquering enemy, or is literally the way that he's doing this? And my question is, if this, I'm not sure if I can make it clear. If we worship this Dharma protector and we will view him as a role model, then we'll follow his style to do. It's made to rationalize my action to fight against my enemy by a violent way, and it will go against the ahimsa, not killing, the basic rule in Buddhism. So how would you explain?
Yeah, he's not to be like your model to follow, right? He's somebody whom they would invite to work on their behalf, right? To go to become warriors, right? So it's not so much this is an example I should follow, but rather it's an assistant, a helper, right? Who sometimes will perform this action, but if he is a tense ground bodhisattva, tense bhumi bodhisattva, then he's doing it out, you could say, justify it, right? He's doing it not out of selfish, he's doing it out of compassion, not for selfish reasons, right? But yeah, he's not something to be followed, but something to ask for help at the time of crisis.
Right. Thank you, Professor. There's another question. I have another question about it. You know, I was wondering whether the places he from, like Tamaru Chongtong Popchong, right? Which is the place that where he come from. I was wondering whether it's something that geographically identify or something that is mystical or, you know.
Yeah, it's not like a geographical place, right?
Yeah.
It's a northwestern direction from Jambudvipa,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
Not only Jambudvipa itself, but somewhere outside of Jambudvipa. So just like Amitābha's land or Akshopya's land, right? They are not on the Jambudvipa itself. So his land is somewhere in northwestern, and his sister's or a consort is on the northeastern direction. So it's not a pure land, but it's like a, you know, it's this terrifying place, and it's somehow like this pure Dharma Dhatu which can manifest as such, as this terrifying place.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
In the Greek community, there is a there is a two kind of you know, view about him. One of them is very positive. In Genshin's tradition, the Genshin Zhangzhepa's tradition, he tries to portray Wakti as Yeshiva. That means like, you know, enlightened.
So
Dharma
see,
Protectors.
they also do in Tibetan.
Yeah, and there is another in the Greek community who I think that he's just a mundane Dharma Protector, but not that negative as much as, you know, people think.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is no agreement there who he is, right? Yeah. And Mongols embraced both.
So the ambiguity comes from Tibet. And it's transferred. Yeah. But I think it would be fair to say that.
But in the text themselves, he's invoked as Yamantaka, as Hayagriva, as even Vajrabhairava, as you know, Amitābha, even.
But I think it would be fair to say that within a Buddhist context, this is all to be understood symbolically and a way of transforming and purifying one's own defilements. Now, if it's taken outside of Buddhist context and used in a different way, then it's no longer within the doctrinal Buddhist edifice, right? And I think this ambiguity is not so much an ambiguity perhaps inherent in Buddhist practices, but in the people who use it without necessarily taking into account the Buddhist context. Would you say that would be a fair assessment?
I don't know, really, because I don't know if I could completely agree with that, simply because of what texts say. All these rituals, there is nothing symbolic there. It says, kill, you know, slay, flay the skin of the enemy and trod him on the ground, and just horrible, you know, really gruesome things. And unless you always think that enemy, but no, they have used it also at the times when, even at the time when, during revolutionary period, when Buddhism was being destroyed, lamas were doing creating new texts on how to what to do, and talking about guns and bless my gun, and you know, let me shoot them.
Well, I mean, just because it's used by lamas, it doesn't
No,
mean
but when you have a
necessarily.
mantra of killing, what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think from Vajrayana, because I think this is it's kind of on the borderline, because I think if we would have to interpret it symbolically to embrace, if we say it's within a Buddhist context,
Right.
and the moment that it is not, and it's actually read literally, then I think we're outside the Buddhist domain. Now, whether this is the Sangha that's performing it or lay people, still that doesn't necessarily make them Buddhists. Because I think, there's a certain core concept, I think, that all, including Vajrayana, maintains of a certain, Buddhist edifice, one arguably. So it has to be done symbolically. I think that from my perspective, the moment that it is not read symbolically, even if these descriptions are violent, that's how to overcome our own prejudices between you and me, right? It's a way also pushing us to.
I would like it to be that way. It's much easier to solve it, right? To think that way, but
I think it's like the Crusades in the name of Jesus going on to a crusade.
But that is different. They're not going to conquer another country.
No, but even in battle, right?
But if Dharma in your own land is going to be destroyed, that there is the place, even if you know you will go to hell for a while because of that, right? That's
all right. In Crusades it was the same. It was to rescue the Holy Land, right? Again, you're doing it for the Dharma, the Christian Dharma, right? And I think, again, we have parallels in all religions, and I think at some point we really need to reflect and say, well, yes, if in the name of religion, certain acts are being performed that actually go against the very fundamental teachings of that religion, then maybe we're outside the religious realm right now. We're in a political, different agendas that are being fulfilled.
That was it. He has very pragmatic roles, and that was assigned to him by Buddhists, not by non-Buddhists, by lamas. And but this Yalgosan Hotak that I showed the photo and whom you met, he was hired by Ganden Monastery to perform certain rituals, and he would take be possessed by Jamsran to do rituals of protecting from shamanic curses and shamanic attacks. Right? So it is a protection of Dharma. What he actually does, I don't know, does to shamans, or is just creating some kind of a circle of protection. It's difficult to know, but that was his kind of duty for a monastery. But when you met him, he's very compassionate, obviously has some CDs there, right? Nice person. So he doesn't manifest in any fierce, violent form, but does these rituals.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah. With regard to Dharma Protector, there are countless, I guess, in our Vajrayana. Whether they are super mundane or mundane, or wrathful or peaceful, do you see them if you quantify them in a conceptual and non-conceptual figure? We don't really find any historical evidence for
Exactly.
So if you quantify them, are they all a conceptual figure? Is it fair to say that?
In a way, yes. I mean, just the fact that they speak about, like Jamsran, right? Somebody who bites in the Dharma Dhatu, which is primordially pure, shows that he doesn't really exist as an entity, right? You kind of you bring something from the Dharma Dhatu when you visualize and you create. So you make it pure in that way, but actually make it manifest as fierce, violent, cruel, and so on. That's why I said at the beginning that in a Buddhist context, what you imagine or what you visualize matters. It creates identity. I mean, we already, according to Buddhism, we're imagining this room, people, right? We don't see ultimate reality as it is. So we already look in a certain kind of imaginative ways at this reality anyway. So just imagining something else, if it can work, because this imagination in my mind that you are all here and that these chairs are gray and red creates my own experiences, my own reality, and my own kind of type of epistemology, but perception. But which means that imagination has power, and then you can imagine anything. When you visualize, when you do ritual of pacification, you are visualizing white deity, right? And you are creating another sense of reality there. So he's real and he's not really real. Ultimately not real, no ontological basis, right?
So by nature, all other deities are similar.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what is symbolized, like holding up blood or whatsoever violence,
Right.
I think, as you described, I think it maybe it is symbolic or actually it never happened, such things.
Yeah. Yeah, Mongolians tend to take things more literary in that regard. Yeah.
Just because just also interesting. While you're here, because you mentioned you've been working on a book about visualization and imagination and the efficacy of it more generally. Mm-hmm. Could you sort of spell out a little bit what you actually are, what your argument is in that book about, how does it work? How does it work? What do you sort of argue? I'd be really interested to hear.
Actually, it is co-authored book, but I have my 4 chapters authored by myself, and then my colleague who is an art historian has her 4 chapters, and we just have an introduction and conclusion together. So it's kind of interdisciplinary approach. And while she's looking primarily in material images and some kind of imagination that goes along with them, I look primarily into mental images and somewhat in relation to physical images, but not as much, just in the cases where it looked appropriate. So the whole, so we look at it, try to approach it interdisciplinary way, by looking how image and imagination, whether mental or material image, plays a role in this interplay between text, image, and ritual, but ritual primarily referring to the sadhana rituals or prayer rituals. So the argument is, so there are several arguments that I bring from my side of a book, is that imagination creates new mental imprints. When you're visualizing, imagining, I was primarily looking in practices of imagination that were played out in different prayers and ritual texts related to Shambhala and Shambhala deities and Pova practices and so on in Mongolia. And she was looking also related to Shambhala, but from a very different perspective. And so my argument was that in those types of practices, the goal of those mental images is to replace images of an ordinary world and to create the new imprints into the mental subconscious, alaya vijnana, or any way you like to call it, in order to prepare one for a rebirth in Shambhala. So in this practices of imagination, one is not only imagining how Shambhala looks or how palace looks and deities that are there, but actually one imaginatively engages in activities there and does all kinds of actions in imagination and preparing one's life, preparing oneself for a life there, and preparing, also transforming one's ordinary world already into Shambhala. So the Shambhala becomes a mental state, not just some place that you travel to. And that it not only that creates new experiences, but creates new types of knowledge that without those experiences, this knowledge would not exist. Without those imaginations, it would not be there. And I try to show how it plays out, that the goal is there to really eliminate the imprints of this world, which again are imprints imagined world, right? Imagined reality in which we live, and we don't see it as it is. So approximating through imagination, coming closer to what is truly real. And then also showing that through this process, one goes through different understanding of what really Shambhala is about. Is it a physical place, or is it a pure land, one more Sukhavati, or is it really enlightenment, pure state of mind? So, so that this is a process not only of development of one's perception of the world, but also develop cognitive transformations that imagination plays. So that's some of these basic. There's so much that you could do, you know, because so many texts, Buddhist texts deal, right? Any Buddhist text or practice deals with imagination, right? You can't escape it. And it's not an imagination like a child's play. And it's not imaginations kind of freely, you can imagine whatever you like. These are in a way prescribed in imagination, which means they have particular function. They want to bring you to particular knowledge that you haven't had before. So you can't just say, oh, I'll imagine it this way or that way, right? It is very much prescribed. It's a path.
But I think this is exactly what we stated. If we take it literally, we can miss, let's say, the enlightened aspect of it, where we can go using this deity in a symbolic way and in different way than just thinking it only literally.
But so they do still believe that somebody can misuse them, that if you really succeed in a practice on a Jamsran, if you do sadhanas on Jamsran, you can kill someone by just staring at them or by getting angry or irritated by them.
There's always people who are who are misguided and I think misinterpret things, right? But yeah, thank you very much. I think with that, maybe we would just thank Professor Wallace for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you all for coming and for questions. Good questions.
We'll have a little offering from our center. Maybe we can come here.
Oh, thank you.
Volumes, yes.
Did you like this?
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you to Piku, the country without glasses.
Yeah, me too. Yes.
And to Piku.